Tuatahi nei, he mihi atu ki ao koutou, oku tūngange, oku tuahine no ngā iwi take o te ao whānui. First, greetings to my Indigenous brothers and sisters. E mihi kawaki ana tēnei ki ao koutou, I raro I te korowai o ta rangi nui, rangi roa tāwhiri rangi, te hau whakaora tau e pāngia ngā kiri o te tangata. Greetings to you under the cloak of the Sky Father, the heavenly winds, the life-giving winds, the winds that caress the skin of all people. E mihi kawaki ana ki ao koutou, I runga I te whāriki o te papatua, noku te papatua ārangi, tūkai pō, tūkai ao, te papa e maroro ki te itinga, ki te opunga, te papa awhi ani a tātou o ngā whakatupuranga. Greetings to you on the woven mat of the Earth Mother. The Earth Mother stretches to the sunrise and the sunset, sustains us through the day, sustains us through the night, the embracing Earth Mother that embraces all generations. Hoi anō, he mihi mahana tēnei ki ao koutou, he mihi whānui, he mihi atu anō ki a tātou, tēnā tātou katoa. So greetings to all of you, warm greetings, broad greetings, and greetings again. Thank you very much for having me present at this really cool looking conference. I'll share my screen. So as Mil outlined, I'm a principal advisor to our main tribal group in New Zealand on COVID, to the Office of the Kingitanga, which is a large federation in the middle of the North Island of New Zealand, which has our oldest continuing hereditary leadership, and also to a tribal collective called Te Kahu Taonui, which covers the 7 main tribes in the area that I come from. I sort of fell into covering COVID because of gaps in what was coming from our government. As an academic, I suppose I specialised in forensic research, so often in ideological debates, when you have concepts or terms that arise, then I'm the kind of researcher that works out where they came from and how they evolved and so on and so forth. I also had when I was an undergraduate, had a background in calculus, and as time has moved on now through COVID, I think I've written about 100, maybe 120 articles and reports for Indigenous Māori communities. So just a bit about Aotearoa New Zealand as a backgrounder. Aotearoa yesterday, at contact, our population was probably 250,000 people. The first main contact with Europeans was in 1769. Captain James Cook and the Endeavour, they brought the first diseases to New Zealand. We signed the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, which marks the beginning of systematic colonisation by what we call Pākehā people, by Europeans in New Zealand. For a period of about 40 years, we fought what academics used to call the Māori Wars, and today call New Zealand Wars, kind of giving it a bicultural touch. My view would be that more properly they should be called the Pākehā Wars on Māori. From 1840 onwards, so from the signing of the treaty, we lost 95% of our land, and by the end of the century, our population had declined by 83% to just 42,000 people. This is the kind of colonial picture of the settlement of New Zealand. racial harmony and everything was pretty nice. For us, it's a bit more, there's a harder edge to it. This is a picture, paintings and a photograph in the aftermath of 4 battles that were fought during the wars. The one on the top left there is from the 1845 war. My great-grandmother's grandfather fought in that battle. This one here is on the right is from one of the Waikato battles. The one on the bottom left is a pictograph of a battle. It's called a battle at Rangi, but it was really army units came through there, and it was an area where we had non-combatants and sick people, and a lot of people were killed there. And this one on the bottom right is taken in about 1900, and it's a group of veterans from the Battle of Ōrākau that was fought in 1865. My great-grandfather fought at that battle, and we lost 300 men, women and children after they ran out of ammunition and tried to escape through the swamp and were run down by the colonial cavalry. But this is a good picture of some old veterans, and it's a favourite in my collection. Aotearoa today, we face a system with broad racism on multiple fronts in terms of language loss. At one stage, we only had 3% of Māori who continued to speak the language. Cultural loss, inequalities in health, our life expectancy is much lower. Youth suicide, we have the highest rate of adolescent suicide in the OECD. We're over 50% of prisoners. We're the most people living in poverty, poor housing. Homelessness is a really big issue in New Zealand at the moment, and we have large numbers of, or the greatest proportion of those people are ours, and there are inequalities in education, employment, and unemployment. So that's one side of the picture. Another side of the picture is New Zealand's population today is 5.1 million. So from 40,000 people in about 1900, we now number 854,000 people. We're 17% of the population. We have about 80 main tribes and 500 or more sub-tribes. We had a very strong renaissance. It was driven by a strong protest movement led by young people beginning in about 1970. Today, we have a Māori, what we call a Māori economy that's worth about $60 billion. We have more than 1,100 Māori PhDs. More than 1,000 of those in the last 20 years. So when I first did my PhD, I used to know the name of every other Māori who had gained a PhD as my role models, and at that time was about 1995, there were only 30. So it's a really big jump. In our parliament and government, we have 25 Māori members of parliament. We have 7 dedicated Māori seats in Parliament, and just as of today, we've won representation on most, actually it might not be most, but a lot more, on 78 local regional governments. So that would be the equivalent of, say, the government of Manitoba, or say Toronto City Council, and that sort of level. So that's a really big win for us. I'm not sure what the final count is, but before the last round of advocacy, we only had dedicated representation on 3 of 78 local government bodies. So it's jumped up something to like 40 or 50 now, I think, just this week. This is some of the history of our Renaissance. On the left here this is a famous old photo of one of our elder women, Whina Cooper, who in 1975 walked from our tribal area at the very top of the North Island to Parliament in Wellington, under the mantra of not 1 acre more. So she began that walk with herself and one of her grandchildren, and it grew and grew and got bigger as it went on. This middle picture here, Bastion Point, is another important protest for us in 1978. Our rights to the seabed and foreshore. There was a big protest about 15 years ago. And some of you might be familiar with this protest, which is over land that was originally confiscated from Māori during the wars, and all the inhabitants were forcibly evicted and then hunted through the bush, and people were imprisoned without trial, and there were a lot of deaths and so on. This is another picture of Whina down here under her call, not 1 more acre, and yeah, she lived in quite a rural community, and she was a really good shot by all accounts. So one of our great leaders who passed away about 25 years ago. This is another group of protests, again on the foreshore and seabed. Protests over honouring the treaty. This is another protest march there. This man standing in the middle was the leader of the co-leader of the Independent Māori Party, who had a presence now in Parliament for about 15 years. This is one of the leaders of our main white political parties who made a very derogatory speech about Māori in 2005, very right-wing, and on our National Day, someone threw a clod of earth into his mouth. This is a more recent event a few years ago, and a similar event, although in this case it wasn't a clod of earth, it was something a bit more intimate, and that was seen as newsworthy at the time. One of the big strengths of our Renaissance is really the emergence of our young people. In our last election, last September, amongst Māori communities, the majority of people who cast a vote were young people aged between 18 and 24, and they're going to be very talented, far more educated than my generation, very capable, and our future is going to lie with that emerging youth, and I think it's a very bright future. So there's kind of two sides to New Zealand. There's the racism on one side, and then there's the strength of our Renaissance. This is pictures of the history of the land wars, or the Pākehā wars, European wars on Māori was suppressed for quite a long time, and our honouring of people who fought and died in lands that were lost is increased over the years, and these are pictures of different tribes in different regions celebrating the anniversaries of those battles. This one in the bottom right here is the commemoration of the battle at Ōrākau, the one I referred to, where we lost 300 men, women and children. So a history of pandemics and epidemic events in Aotearoa, New Zealand. At a first level, Indigenous peoples are susceptible to poor outcomes in a pandemic or epidemic because we're immune deficient. We don't have immunity against European diseases, and pretty much if you look at the world literature, Indigenous peoples will suffer a population drop of between 70 to 90% within 50 to 100 years of contact. It varies quite a bit depending on the place. Sometimes it's a lot sooner. in that opening period, as I said, it's immune deficiency and racism that are the key. And our first major epidemic occurred in 1969 when the Captain Cook's crew knowingly spread syphilis and gonorrhea and also tuberculosis into our population. So their ship logs written by officers and Captain Cook himself expresses concern about that, but he doesn't do anything to stop it. And in some of the areas where they spent a fair amount of time, syphilis and gonorrhea just went through our populations at a very huge level. Now, from multiple independent sources, both Māori and Pākehā, dating from the 1800s, we also know that there was a large epidemic that our ancestors referred to as the Great Rewharewha. That was either measles or flu, and that took about 50% of our population over a period of between 2 to 3 years. So it's probably, other than the 2018 Spanish flu, the closest thing to COVID that we would have experienced. There's a second period follows that, and this is something that's pretty much missing in the literature on pandemics, is that there is a time when Indigenous peoples begin to become immune to European diseases. But the problem at that stage is we change from being immune deficient to becoming immunosuppressed, because after losing our land, we end up becoming impoverished, becoming forced to live on increasingly smaller parcels of more marginalized land with decreasing access to cultivations and traditional food sources. So this is what started to occur in the 1800s. And after the signing of the treaty, there's about 30 other epidemics to 1900, all of which take a large toll on our population. Many Māori began to live life in a state of permanent epidemic. From 1900 to World War II, there's another 20 epidemic events. And in this one example, in a place called Maunga Pohatu, 50% of everyone under 30 years of age died during a 20-year period. And it's a really significant decline. And this is just another example of the type of existence people had. At Waimamaku in the Hokianga, this is during the 1918 flu, a group of 14 was found, 12 of which had died. They included a woman and 4 of her children. Her husband and 2 other children had died during the typhoid epidemic in 1911. And their twin daughters were the only survivors. And one of the really important notes here is that the first Europeans that got there said that of the deceased persons they found, a lot of them had actually died of starvation because no help had been provided for that township. So that history of a pandemic and epidemic events is underwritten by racism on a number of levels. So at one level, it's rhetorical, and it's about blaming the victims of disease. So a lot of the government papers from the time, newspapers, made the comments that Māori were dying because they were a weaker race. A guy called Isaac Featherson said we must smooth the pillow of a dying race, and Māori are dying because they are dirty, and Māori are dying because Māori women in particular are dirty. There's resource racism, and that is when a pandemic and epidemic event occurs, more resources go to the European community and less to the Māori community. So we had separate hospitals. European hospitals had doctors and nurses. Māori hospitals had a nurse. Sometimes it was a minister. Sometimes it was just the local leader and his family. And in the town I currently live in, the person who looked after Māori patients suffering from the Spanish flu was actually a former soldier who had got sick, recovered, and he just tried to treat people in the way he was treated. Then you have vaccine racism. So in the early 1900s, Māori medical staff nurses weren't allowed to deliver vaccines. It was against the law. We have lots of examples where vaccines were available, but they were withheld from our communities. And we had a lot of vaccine under delivery. And so one example in 1918 at Tōpū, 80 vaccines were delivered for 300 people, and they were just told to choose and pick who would receive them and who wouldn't. Now, in that particular example, the government had actually produced 700,000 vaccines, and there was enough for everyone, but what applied was a differential by race. Then you get historical graphical racism, and this is something we still haven't tackled as a country, but basically Pākehā European historians have underestimated the Māori population at contact, lessened the impact of a European disease, and exaggerated the impact of intertribal fighting to deny history, amplify our savagery as an explanation for our demise, and thereby justify and magnify the benefits of their colonial civilizing mission. This is a picture of a memorial in one of the Central North Island tribes put up to the victims of the 2018 Spanish flu. And there was an ongoing toll. This is just a list of different epidemics that have gone on. From the Spanish flu in 1918, our death rate was 9 times higher. Coming up to even just a couple of years ago in 2019, we had a measles epidemic. Māori and Pacific peoples were 80% of all cases. And despite pleas to the government to declare an emergency wasn't declared soon enough, and measles was transported offshore to Samoa in the Pacific, and they had 80 deaths, most of them being children younger than 5 years of age, and it's a repeat of some other events in earlier history. Is a quote from someone: "My great-grandfather lost his wife and a brother to the Spanish flu. The brother survived the Western Front. He was a soldier in First World War, only to succumb to the Black Flu. My grandmother lost a brother to typhoid in 1911, another to Spanish flu, and a brother and sister to tuberculosis in the 1930s. Some families have lost everyone. They cease to exist." So I know some of those families in my area. So coming to COVID-19, we have a number of vulnerabilities. We have a lower life expectancy. Our housing is generally poorer, and we have more overcrowded housing. We have more people that live in poverty, and we also have high comorbidities like heart disease, diabetes, renal disease, respiratory disorders, cancer. And with a lot of these, like diabetes, we acquire those 10 to 15 years earlier than Europeans, so it makes our population particularly vulnerable. And research modelling during the pandemic in New Zealand has shown that Māori are twice as likely to be hospitalised and 50% more likely to die. During our 2020 response, so in the first year of COVID, there's a number of issues that reflected a degree of structural racism. European health providers under-tested our population quite early on. We had one authority, so a health authority in one region, refused to let qualified Māori medical staff test patients, which is kind of an echo of something that happened about 100 years ago. A lot of the data on testing was obscured, and a lot of the data was withheld. And one of the problems we had is that district health authorities would release quite flattering data about their progress rather than the real information. And I was involved in an incident where a group of health authorities released what looked like quite good data on the testing of the Māori population. But when I asked them what the figures were for each individual health authority, I never got a reply. And I understood why that was, because I already knew from my own sources that in two of the health authorities, the figures were actually very, very low for Māori. In New Zealand, you can make official requests for information under different legislation, but for the most part last year those were just deflected, and if you were like, if you got an answer, you usually didn't get the data with it. You were told that because it's an emergency they couldn't provide it, and so on and so forth. So part of my role has been filling in the information gaps. New Zealand, one part of our response has been quite brilliant. With the first wave, we beat that back to zero in 100 days. After we did so, we opened up managed isolation and quarantine facilities to house arrivals from overseas who tested positive for COVID at the border. But a lot of those were established in cities and areas with high Māori populations. And this was about in the middle of last year. And one of the calls that went out is that although we've beaten the first wave and we have no cases in the community, we need to maintain a high level of random testing in case there's a breach at the border or in managed isolation. And those requests and warnings were ignored, and the outcome was a major outbreak in Auckland, of which 80% of the cases were Māori and Pacific peoples. I actually gave a interview 1 month before that outbreak, and on the basis of the high numbers of positive cases coming into the country and the absence of precautionary testing, I predicted that within 2 to 4 weeks we would have a major outbreak, and that's what unfolded. So that's how we see the government management of the COVID response, and this has been our response, the Māori response to COVID. I like this picture because we're really determined not to suffer as we have in previous epidemics, and because of our renaissance, our really strong leadership, we're in a position now to push back against a pandemic in a much greater way than we previously have been. So the strength of the 1970s Renaissance is that Māori are in a stronger position to fight back against a pandemic event than at any other time in our history, and that's really true. So we've formed our own advocacy groups. This one here, Te Whakakaupapa Urita, is a collection of Māori doctors. There's the National Iwi Pandemic Group, of which I'm a senior advisor. We have our own information outlets, and we have also allies in organisations such as this one here, Tōpū Naha Matatini, which is a mixed group of European and Māori academics who produce data to fill in give body to the narrative that we don't receive from the government. In funding, although we believe that the government is not being catering adequately to our position within COVID. The Māori members of Parliament are good advocates for us, and in last year and this year they secured significant financial packages to help support our communities. That was last year, and this year another financial package to support a Māori vaccine program. That translated into a whole series of actions. Our Māori tribal community organisation distributed thousands of food, hygiene and COVID-19 packages. We had a lot of people lose their jobs and employment and suffer financially. And because a greater percentage of our people are at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale, food packages and those sorts of things were really important. So tens of thousands of those were sent out all over the country. We have our own Māori health providers. Unfortunately, we don't have our own central Māori health authority. We don't have anything like the Canadian Indigenous Service, or in the United States, something like the Indian Health Service. Our health providers are all adjuncts to mainstream European suppliers, but they also have good leadership and they're very agile. And so when it came to testing, they basically started elasticizing the rules. And by the end of May last year, the rate of testing for Māori ended up passing Europeans. There was quite a struggle in there for the period of about a month before we achieved that. Checkpoints is another thing. Some of our tribes and communities mounted checkpoints on roads to stop people from outside coming into their communities. There was a lot of media coverage of that, and they were widely criticised as willfully and illegally impeding citizens going about their legal business. The irony of that is that the checkpoints kept quite meticulous records, and they intercepted thousands of mainly European day trippers and holiday makers. So when we had lockdowns, rather than stay at home, some people started going on holidays and day trips and breaking the travel rules all over the place. And in some instances, like one tribal area I know, over a period of about 2 months, they intercepted 7,000 at their checkpoints. And what was interesting is that no one described these rule breakers as doing anything illegal. The other side to the checkpoints is that they were also widely successful. And got a bit of a graph here up this top end. On the left here, we have this is a list of all our health districts, and the graph shows the number of cases per 100,000 of population within each health district. And the ones in purple here are the tribal areas where people mounted checkpoints. And as you can see, the average here at 14.1 per 100,000 is exactly half what it is everywhere else in the country that didn't have checkpoints. And the stories of the checkpoints ended up being that some European communities started demanding that the police mount checkpoints in their areas for the same reason we did, to protect populations and protect communities, both Māori and Pākehā or European, living in those areas. And there's some pictures of these people here on the right are from where I'm from. This guy here is one of the main organisers of the checkpoints. These people, none of them are trained health professionals or anything, but they did everything right. They taught themselves what the rules were, what the health and safety precautions they should take, and they adopted all of those, and the same over here. This is one of my favorite photo from the checkpoints. One of our young people urging people to stay at home, and referring to people driving around who shouldn't be as eggs. It's a good one. This is a picture of just a normal school crossing. I used this in an article with a bit of satire, that there was proof that occasionally there are European people who willfully impede the legal travel of other members of the community at bus stops, at pedestrian crossings. Sorry. This year, one of the big issues we face is in the vaccination program. So we have a vaccination governance group. It has about 12 people on it. There are 2 that are Māori, but none with any medical experience. So one of them is a businessman and one of them is a government advisor. Beneath that, we have an operational group that has 1 Māori on it, again without any medical expertise. And then we have an advisory group, which does include 3 to 4 Māori medical experts, but in an advisory capacity only, and that is nothing gets through. The things I've said and recommended have never managed to be inserted into the vaccination plan. Our vaccination policy discriminates against Māori. So, you know, in Canada, I've looked at the vaccination approach applied in British Columbia. So British Columbia prioritises border workers, health workers, and remote Indigenous communities. We don't prioritise remote communities in New Zealand, and that's going to become a big problem. Like, how do you deliver a vaccine out into those remote communities? And our vaccine approach doesn't equivocate that the risk between a 50-year-old member of our community and the risk between a 65-year-old European is about the same. And so the main priority group in the current phase of vaccination are over 65-year-olds. Now, because of our lower life expectancy, there are 400,000 Europeans that fall into that category, but there's only about 50,000 of our people that do so. And some of the deaths that we've experienced, they actually occurred in that younger age group. So, you know, there's real concerns about how the vaccination of Māori is going to unfold. And at the moment, we're currently the lowest vaccinated ethnicity in New Zealand. This chart here, what this does is compare the ratio of people in your community who've been vaccinated to your percentage of the population. And so you can see that the European group, the Asian group, and Pacific peoples groups, they're being vaccinated at a much higher rate than we are. We probably share about the same risk as Pacific peoples, but our risk is much higher than these groups, and we're quite a way behind. So that's a very major concern. So as a bit of a summary to where the current situation is, because of the strength of our communities stemming from the 1970s Renaissance, because of our leadership and networking, we are this little red square right in the middle. We have the lowest percentage of cases compared to our population of any ethnic group. So we've done really well, but it has a lot more to do with the strength of our communities than it does to government policy. And then just over on the right here, in terms of admissions to intensive care and in terms of death, although the number of cases in our community is lower, we're the highest percentage of people who have ended up in intensive care, and relative to population, the highest percentage of deaths. And that reminds us to remain vigilant, because if we do have a severe outbreak, we're the people that are most vulnerable to a detrimental outcome. And these are those figures taken again, that we're in the middle here. That's our percentage of population, number of cases. You can see that's low, it's less than half of our share of the population, but a few more hospitalized. And then when we get to ICU, the numbers of Māori ICU and deaths, the number of Māori is disproportionately high, even off that low figure. So just as a final note, we know that there's international vaccine equality and racism. Western countries pre-purchased the majority of the 17 billion vaccine doses that can be manufactured around the world throughout this year. And that's led to an unequal distribution between rich and poor countries, and between rich and poor communities. And we're looking, the long-term or the medium to long-term projection is that we'll probably need 3 to 4 rounds of vaccination. So Canada, United States, New Zealand will all have a round of vaccination that's currently underway. What we need to bear in mind is that internationally, this first round won't end until the end of next year or early in 2023, because there's just not enough vaccines to go around. We'll probably need a second round of vaccinations to deal with the 3 main variants that are circling the globe, the British variant, South African, and Brazilian variant. And that is because the vaccines that we are using were designed to deal with earlier strains of COVID-19 and not these 3 hyper-infectious ones. And it's also, the evidence is showing that the main vaccines are less effective against those. They still protect against severe disease, and they're not too bad with the British one, but particularly the South African one are significantly less effective. And then we'll probably need a third round of vaccines, because in an unequal world, we're going to end up with well-vaccinated Western countries, but under-vaccinated poor countries in parts of Southeast Asia, Africa in particular, and Latin America. And what that's going to do is allow the opportunity for new, what we might call 4th generation variants emerge. And these, most of them will not be too harmful, but some of them are likely to be more virulent and have higher rates of fatality. And the one that's emerged just at the moment is this one called B1617.2, which is now, so international vaccination has taken down the rate at which the British, South African, and Brazilian ones are increasing in Europe, the United States, and Britain. But this strain here is accelerating in all those countries and quite quickly. So in Britain, for instance, it's doubled every week for the last 3 to 4 weeks, which is a really bad sign. And this is just a graphic to back that up. It just shows where the current vaccination program is heading. So in the United States, Europe, they should get through most of their population by the end of this year. The light green, Canada, a lot of Latin America, Russia, Australia, and New Zealand, we'll probably get there about the middle of next year. But then in these poorer areas, Southeast Asia, Africa in particular, parts of Latin America, they'll be lucky to get a first round of vaccination through their populations by the end of 2022. And this is where other variants are likely to come from. So, just for our communities, but I think this applies for all Indigenous communities, we need to vaccinate as many of our people as possible as a first layer of protection, because there is more to come with COVID. That's certain. We are probably about halfway there at best. Well, not noho haumaru, which means to stay safe and self-sovereign.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Taonui. We have a few minutes for any questions. For those of you that want to ask something, maybe put it in the chat or else raise your hand quickly, and I'll get Dr. Taonui to answer anything. But in the meantime, I wanted to ask you, can you further expand on what you're talking about, the Maori health providers and elasticizing? I thought that was interesting.
So the rules for testing in New Zealand in March, April last year was that only test people who have visible symptoms. But of course, one of the problems with COVID early on was that whole question of people who are asymptomatic, so not displaying overt symptoms, being infectious. So what our health providers did is basically set those rules aside and adopt an approach which said, let's test everyone we can get our hands on. And of course, the more people they tested, the more confidence other people had to come forward and get tested. So one part there, we were testing in our community was so low, we were maybe about 30% of the average testing rate for Europeans. But by the time the first wave ended, we were getting tested more often. I'll have to say that one tribal organisation I know in an area where there was very low testing in our communities, they offered a food parcel if you would come and bring your family and get tested. So that's an example of elasticizing. I think that's what's has to happen with the vaccine effort. There are rules and guidelines about which age should be tested first, but a lot of our communities don't have the resources to say send the 60-year-olds in for vaccination, then 30s, then 40s. So what our Māori health providers will end up doing is getting as many people together from families as possible, and then vaccinating, say, everyone over 18 years, which is not dissimilar, I think, to what's happening in First Nations in Canada.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here. How do you think the vaccination program should change to increase the effectiveness for the Maori? And there's another comment. What does EGGS, EGGS stand for? That was in one of the pictures that you presented.
Calling someone an egg is an insider cultural epithet, which comes from quite a famous movie where a young boy's got a wayward dad, and he stands up one day and says to his dad, "I think you're an egg." So this young man, when he was on the checkpoint, he wrote this poster, "Stay home, you egg," essentially. But yeah, so I suppose that's an inside cultural joke. With the other question in terms of what needs to happen with vaccination, we probably need our own Māori vaccination group or authority. So, for instance, in the United States, Indigenous Native Americans have suffered really badly during that big first wave, and we all know the example of the Navajo and so But what's happening there is the federal government can disperse vaccines directly to Indian health providers, whereas in New Zealand, the vaccines go to mainstream European providers and then to our providers. And in the United States, the more direct approach has meant that First Nations, Native Americans are the highest vaccinated group in the United States now. So a complete reversal of their experiences last year. And if we probably need a system that's like that.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Taonui. Is 4 a.m. there Saturday morning, and
Yes,
you said
it is.
Sleep in. So thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it, and we'll talk again.
Thank you very much for having me, and congratulations on running what's a really important conference and sharing knowledge and information that's going to help Indigenous communities. And I trust the rest of your conference goes really well. Yeah!